Good evening.
Good evening.
Tennessee law permits, but does not require, state execution of some persons convicted of murder. United States constitutional law, through its Sixth Amendment right to counsel, Eighth Amendment prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment, and 14th Amendment requirements for due process, restricts and arguably regulates the state's exercise of this extraordinary and terrifying power. Yet historic racial disparities in state killings persist, and sometimes state mistake or state misconduct convict and condemn innocent persons to face unjust death. These dealings in death, whether criminal or procedural, take a toll on every person involved. They stain and strain the professional, civic, and private communities they touch. They break us. This course responds to that breach. Again, good evening. I am Phyllis Hildreth, Associate Professor for Conflict Management here at American Baptist College. And I am here to welcome you to the fourth class session of SO 326, Strategies for Civic Transformation. This semester, we have been focusing on a report that was issued this summer around racial disparities in the death penalty in Tennessee. We came together here at American Baptist College with our good colleagues from the Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, and after great struggle back and forth, decided that this probably deserved more than one night of a panel sitting up and thinking deep thoughts and then going away. So we went old school and took it to the classroom, and we opened the classroom to the public. So for those of you who are not enrolled for credit, the good news is there will not be a test. That said, this evening we are honored to also layer on top of that work this second annual presidential lecture series for American Baptist College. We will have my partner in crime, Stacy Rector, Executive Director of TADP, bring brief remarks on behalf of her organization and introduce the speaker of the hour. But before that, it is my great privilege to introduce to you Forrest E. Harris Sr., President of American Baptist College, to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis Hildreth, for that introduction to the night's experience and for the series that have taken place in the context of your class, and to tie this educational experience with the President Lecture Series, and this President Lecture Series to invite such a stellar scholar activist, Jemar Tisby, to be the President Lecture Series for this class as well as for this general public. I'm excited. We have had engagement with Jemar Tisby before, and he has continued to push forward a vision about racial justice and how justice can serve the whole community in his famous now book, A Color of Compromise. And we appreciate what he has experienced, and his experience has now furthered into scholarship, but now as a public voice. And we need public voices like Jemar Tisby on the lecture circuit with HBCUs, the Black community, and other parts of the community. But his voice needs to be heard in the community that produced him.
Yes, sir.
And I am just pleased, as president of this college, to have the President Lecture Series be a part of this integrated educational experience and have a kind of pedagogical, transformative experience by engaging a book that has now claimed the attention of people who are serious about social justice change, about transformative communities, about systems and structures that continue to perpetuate the problem that you have been addressing. So we are highly, highly enthusiastic about it. And if you read about Jemar, he's inviting people to the table. I read a little piece on your invitation to the table that describes how you came to this point. And as you weave your way through inviting people to the table, the menu is so inviting and it's digestible. So thank you for being here. Thank the Tennesseans for Alternative to the Death Penalty to be a part of this integrative experience and academic experience for our students. And we're just excited about this being a model for the way in which you engage the community, the academics that students need, also what it means to inform the community about these important issues. So I give you a hand in advance for being here.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Stacy Rector, and I'm the Director of Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, and I'm so pleased that you are here. As you've heard, this is the fourth of our 6 sessions, and we're just excited as can be to have Jemar Tisby. I met Jemar via Zoom, maybe going on 2 years ago now. We're on a committee together in this work to end the death penalty, and so we were very excited to meet each other in the flesh this evening. Very exciting. I'm going to tell you more about him, but so I don't forget, please know that he has lots of books and t-shirts and cool stuff out there that I hope you'll check out after the session is over. We also have an information table so that you can take information with you about the death penalty here in Tennessee and why we're so concerned about it, and sign up to get on our email list, which is the best way to get involved with the work that we're doing. And so now, to introduce Jemar Tisby, as you all know, he is a New York Times bestselling author of The Color of Compromise and the award-winning How to Fight Racism. He is a historian who studies race, religion, and social movements, and serves as a professor at Simmons College of Kentucky, which is an HBCU. He is the founder of The Witness, Inc., an organization dedicated to Black uplift from a Christian perspective, and has written for all sorts of news outlets, The Atlantic, The Washington Post. He's been on CNN. He's spoken nationwide at colleges and universities, and we are thrilled that we can add American Baptist College in this series to that list tonight. Welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I like it here. I can already tell. I feel at home. I was telling your president by your presence, I'm honored by. Thank you. And I was saying, I feel there's a kinship here because there's HBCUs and then there's faith-based HBCUs. And so I work at Simmons College of Kentucky, founded in 1879, dreamed up by a group of Black Baptist ministers in 1866. And there is this focus, as we were talking, on social justice fueled by faith in Jesus. So it feels right at home here, warmly welcomed, and I'm grateful that you all took the time out this evening to come join us. This is the beginning of a conversation, and so I do invite you to check out my newsletter. I write there all the time. I'm up at 3, 4 a.m. or midnight or whatever, giving you my latest thoughts, and then, you know, there's all that social media malarkey, but I'm on there. If you don't mind, I just want to tell you a little bit about how I got involved in the criminal legal system and working for change and thinking specifically about the death penalty. I've been black my whole life. And so I know the experience of growing up black, particularly as a black man in America, and harrowing stories of law enforcement. To this day, I have not encountered a black man who did not have some sort of traumatic encounter with law enforcement, which, as we'll talk about, is a systemic issue, not talking specifically about individuals per se. But really, my academic and advocacy focus on the criminal legal system happened in a time that many of us have experienced and was transformative for us. So In August of 2014, a white police officer killed a black teenager named Mike Brown. And suddenly, everybody in the country knew about this place called Ferguson, Missouri. In the midst of it, I'm embedded in these majority white Christian spaces, and we're beginning to talk as a nation again about race. And every movement of racial justice has a banner, a slogan. It was abolition. It was freedom now. It was black power. And in the 21st century, it's Black Lives Matter. 3 very simple words, and yet when you say them in sequence in the right or the wrong context, depending on how you look at it, it can be a lightning bolt. And I'm trying in the midst of this upheaval, these protests, these hashtags, these news stories, to figure out what's going on. I'd been paying attention to race and racial reconciliation, but I hadn't thought as much about the justice angle. And I didn't start thinking about the criminal legal system in an academic sense or an advocacy sense until 2014, 2015. And I remember in particular reading an article. The article was called One Continuous Graveyard. One Continuous Graveyard. And it was written by an independent historian and scholar named Carrie Lee Merritt. This was the picture that headlined the article. Maybe you've seen it before, maybe not, but every time I see it, it's arresting. It makes me stop. I mean, ponder that photo. What he's wearing, the ground that he's on, the position that he's in, curled up in a distortion of the fetal position, the position we hold in the womb, now turned to a torturous position. But what gets me the most is the eyes. See, I tried to guess his age. I'm guessing maybe late teens, early 20s. I'm not sure, because when you look at his eyes, they're experienced eyes. They're eyes that have seen trials and tribulations and sorrows for a lifetime. And so he looks older. But that was just the beginning. See, as I read the article, Dr. Merritt explained some of the origins of modern day policing. And she said, following emancipation, the number of people arrested in the Deep South rose significantly as the substance and enforcement of certain laws changed considerably. In stark contrast to the antebellum period, the vast majority of those now arrested were black. See, when you study history, you start to understand how important origins are. So prior to the Civil War, a lot of towns didn't even have a standing police force. What would happen is, if there was a problem, you call Billy Bob and Joe Bob, and they get their rifle and they get their pistol, and you form a posse and you go and you take care of the problem. Now, most of the time before the Civil War, those forces were used for poor white people, because the black people were all in chains. But then what happens after emancipation? Now you've got 3.5 million free black people wandering around, and the white power structure is saying, what do we do now? Because number one, we still need cheap labor. And number two, I don't like the fact that these people who were in chains and controlled before now have freedom. So what do? Well, we got these budgets for our town. Why don't we write in a budget for a police force? And this time, instead of taking care or targeting poor white folks, we target poor black folks. When I was a teacher, they would, in training, ask us simple questions to get us thinking about more profound concepts. And they asked us, if you plant corn, what do you get? Yeah. You can call in response here. If you plant corn, what do you get? In a teaching context, they're simply saying, what you serve to the students, that's what they're going to give back to you. But in a justice context, the root determines the fruit. The root determines the fruit. So if the origins of policing, of the criminal legal system are so tied to racism, white supremacy, control of black bodies, if that's the root, then what do you think is going to be the fruit? Mass incarceration and over-incarceration, a punitive system, and ultimately a death penalty with the targets disproportionately black and brown and poor folks. Now, I love history, and I could talk about the history all night, but this evening, I want to focus on the color of compromise and the criminal legal system, with a specific focus on theology, on what we as followers of Christ, how we need to be thinking about this. But do ask me about the history during the Q&A, because that's always important. So before we dive into some of the specifics about the criminal legal system, although much of that ground has been covered, I want to go back to some biblical roots. Some seeds that God planted. And I always go back to what we call the doctrine of the image of God. So it's striking to me that all the way back in the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, God lays out what God intends and means for humanity. Theologians and scholars call this the doctrine of the imago Dei, Latin for the image of God, and it comes from Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Here's just a part of it. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image and after our likeness. That's a profound truth, y'all. I go so far as to say that just like the Protestant Reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries, it focused on particular doctrines, namely the doctrine of salvation by faith and related doctrines. I think if there's going to be a Reformation in the 21st century, it would focus on this doctrine, the doctrine of the image of God. Why? Because we live in the most pluralistic society in human history. The United States literally has the nations coming to its doorsteps. We are around people who are different from us in virtually any and every way you can think of. So how do we understand how to relate to one another across these differences? That has its seeds in the doctrine of the image of God. And what does that doctrine say? Well, one thing it doesn't say. There's nothing else in creation that God pronounces in God's image and in God's likeness. Oh, I love being outside. That has been my lifeline in COVID and after, is to take walks in nature. And nature, I mean outside, might be on a sidewalk, certainly would be at a gravel path at best, right? Nevertheless, the sunshine, the trees, the flowers, the bird, all of it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. None of it does God say is made in God's image and likeness. Only human beings. And what does it mean to be made in God's image and God's likeness? It means we share certain attributes with God. We can think, we can reason, we can make moral choices. We can even think about the future and imagine something different and something better. And God introduces us to this concept of being in God's image and likeness in Genesis, but talks about it throughout the Bible, especially in the Psalms, when it uses this beautiful language. of being knit together in the womb, woven together like works of art. That's who we're dealing with. That's who's sitting next to you. That's who's in front and behind you. People who God has considered a work of art. Unique, similar, but different. Nothing in creation has God created in God's image and likeness. That's us. And let me give you a little therapeutic aside. Because we think about God's image and likeness and the beauty and the complexity of who we are, and we say, that's why everyone deserves dignity and respect. That's why we ought to treat other people a particular way with dignity and respect. But guess what? Because you are made in the image of God, you not only treat others with dignity and respect, you got to treat yourself that way. Don't we love to skip over the part where they asked Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like unto it. You shall love the neighbor what? As yourself. Oh, but we skipped that part. The as yourself part. And if we properly understand the doctrine of the image of God, then guess what? You're going to treat yourself with dignity. You're going to treat yourself with respect. You're going to treat yourself with grace and mercy and love. And if it doesn't start with us, and how we view ourselves, how then can we extend that love and that grace and that dignity and that respect to others? Y'all not hearing me tonight. I said something because it spoke to me. If we cannot love ourselves well, we cannot do this justice work. Don't even try it because it's performative. It's superficial, it's shallow, a mile wide and an inch deep, because you don't know what it means to be forgiven. You don't know what it means to be merciful towards yourself. You don't know what it means to experience grace. It's going to be hard for you to extend it to others. So some of this work that we got to do in this justice field is not out there, but in here. Can we hear that? I see. I got several soapboxes up here. You can't see them yet, but they're coming out. I'm just saying, we are made in God's image and likeness. And that is incredible if we understand the profundity of that. That's why statements. Some of y'all were around in 1968. Dr. King's assassinated on April 4th down in Memphis. And he's there to support sanitation workers who are striking. And these men and their supporters, when they were striking, they wore these signs that said, I am a man. That doesn't mean I am male, it means I'm human. And I like to think about these through a theological lens, through an image of God lens, because that phrase, I am a man, or that phrase, Black Lives Matter, those are theological statements, aren't they? They are declarations and assertions of the image of God in people of African descent. So if we look with our spiritual eyes, we can say, oh, that's Genesis 1 talking. That's God talking. Those are my children in that marvelous melanin. And so don't you dare underpay them. Don't you dare mass incarcerate them. Don't you dare execute them. Whew. But here's the kicker. We're Westerners. I don't care if you're black, white, whatever. If you're in the United States, you're a Westerner. And Westerners have this well-earned stereotype of being quite individualistic. The individual is sort of the center of our thinking. In other cultures, it's the community. It's the tribe. It's the collective. So if we apply that thinking to the doctrine of the image of God, guess what? That applies to us not only as individuals, but as groups. We are made in the image and likeness of God, not only as individual human beings, but as collectivities of people, as groups of people. Isn't it interesting that in the book of Revelation 5:9 and 7:9, look and behold, people from every tribe and tongue and nation gathered around the throne, worshiping the Lamb. In the Greek, they say pantata ethne, all ethnicities, all people. So that Some people are going to get a rude awakening, and they get up to heaven and they find out not everybody's white. Not everybody's American. No, all nations, all tribes, all tongues, all kinds of people groups made in God's very image and likeness. And I think that's beautiful. This next picture, I went to Benin in West Africa. Anybody been to Benin? I hadn't either. You have. French speaking. It's wonderful to see all these black people speaking French. Had no idea what they were saying, but it was beautiful. And the food. And not just the traditional food, but they had a condiment there that I fell in love with. It was this spicy paste, and I don't even know what it's called. I just call it hot paste, like hot sauce. It's hot paste. And I saw them make it once, and they had this empty tin coffee can. They filled it with a little bit of charcoal, and they had this pewter metal bowl that they put on top of it. Then they put some chilies in it, maybe some vinegar and salt, I don't know. And then they had just like a mortar and pestle, just ground it into a paste. And it was hot, y'all. It was very hot. Any spicy food fans?
Yes.
Yeah, I am. I'm sort of medium. Don't try to test me with like hot wings or anything. I just like a little bit of heat. This was super spicy, but you know, the spicier it gets, typically the less flavor you can taste. All you taste is the heat. But this had a flavor. It was savory and rich and had depth to it. And I said, this is beautiful. And you know what? I think that's an expression of the image of God. I think that when we get to heaven, it's going to be a buffet. We're going to have injera and oxtail and hot paste there. And it's going to be a celebration of the diversity of people groups. So guess what? Your fashion, your language, your culinary culture, all of that will be redeemed in the new heavens and the new earth. And it's not going to be some flattening out of everything being uniform and the same. It's going to be diverse but unified in the diversity. That is the image of God. And we got to start there, y'all. We got to start with the vision. Why do we like the dream that Martin Luther King Jr. said so much? Because there's a vision of what could be. There's a vision of possibility. And this goes back to what I said about what it means to be made in God's image and likeness. One of the things we can do is envision a future that's different. And we ain't even got to put that much work into it. God gave it to us. Told us what it's going to look like. He said, listen, come back here, come back here. Let me pull back the curtain of eternity. Check it out. That's what's coming. Not yet, not yet, not yet. But you know what? I'm going to teach you this prayer. And when you pray, say, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done. On earth. And I ain't got to wait till heaven. Right? Woo! I didn't know. I told you there's a thin line between preaching and teaching. And I don't know. We in a chapel, so, you know.
Take your time, teacher.
It's just beautiful. Y'all, we don't believe this enough. We don't have it deep down in our bones. I'm convinced that a lot of where we're going wrong in the justice movement today is because we don't have a deep, robust, rich, nuanced theology of justice, which begins with where we're headed, where we're going. We have a beautiful picture to offer the world that goes beyond the here and now, that goes beyond what we can see, that goes beyond the brokenness that's happening right now. We can point to a beautiful future where every tear is wiped, where we study war no more, where death is but a memory. But do you believe that? Because if you don't, you're going to get weary. And one day you're going to sit down and say, you know what? This is too hard. We're not seeing enough progress. Besides, I got all this other stuff to worry about. I got bills to pay. I got people depending on me. I got a ladder in the career to climb. You know what? I'll tweet every once in a while. Or X, is it? I don't know. I'll thread every once in a while, whatever it is. But I'm not going to be up there on the front line. We think hope is this like Pollyanna-ish word, this pie in the sky. Hope, I'm convinced, is less of a feeling and more of an action. The very act of resisting injustice is an act of hope.
That's right.
Yes.
And sometimes you have to act your way, work your way, action your way into the feeling. But I don't know how you get there if you call yourself a Jesus follower, but you haven't caught the vision of what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God and for the world to be remade so that dignity and respect are the norm, not the exception. So, we have this beautiful vision. That's the pattern. That's the root. Problem is, we dishonor the image of God in each other.
That's right.
We do it in all kinds of ways, because of gender, because of how much is or isn't in your bank account. But we definitely do it because of color, because of what we call race. And so I want to talk a little bit about dishonoring the image of God and how Christians have compromised and been complicit in that dishonoring. You know, we've taken and we've twisted the Bible in so many ways that it's almost unrecognizable. And we use those twists and those turns to justify oppression. How many of you have heard of the curse of Ham? So-called curse of Ham, right? This is all the way back in Genesis chapter 9. Abraham gets drunk, his son sees him, he's like, real mad about it. So pronounces a curse, says, cursed be Canaan. So how did it become the curse of Ham? But anyway, it said, cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Now they interpreted Ham, one of the descendants, as a person who was African and darker skinned. So what white Christians did was say that if you are of African descent, then you inherited this curse of Ham. And a servant to your brother shall you be, by which they took a slave. So they were saying, Christians, using the Bible, saying that God made you this way. That God made you a slave. That God made you fit only for bondage, only for servitude. Wasn't it convenient for white folks that they were made to be masters all of a sudden? Huh? Funny how that works out. But we dishonor and we devalue the image of God in other people when we do things like that, but that's not all. One of the things that I often tell my students, I say, you know, you really know you're in trouble when your mama calls you not just by your first name, but by your first, middle, and last name. Stephen Aloysius Williams, get over here. You know it's big time. You know it's serious. And so when I want to talk about slavery seriously, I don't just use one name. I call it by its full name. Race-based chattel slavery. Every society in human history has some form of unfree labor. But the innovation in what became the United States was the race-based chattel portion. So the race-based part we get. People of African descent were legally and socially codified as eligible for slavery. That's what it meant to be black. In the that's what the designation meant. That's what it indicated. That you were eligible for enslavement, and the majority of us were, even with a few exceptions. They could always be 12 years enslaved. Even if you was free in the north, you could be caught because your skin color made you eligible for enslavement no matter what your legal status. So that's the race-based portion, but we often forget the chattel portion. Anybody know a synonym for chattel? Property. I call this sociological alchemy. alchemy is changing lead into gold. This sociological alchemy changed a person into property. So not only was slavery based on race, when you were categorized as a slave, you were redefined not as a person, but as property, or as they called it, chattel. And that's what happens with enslavement. Not only do you kidnap people or barter for people, not only do you rip them from their homeland, but when you put them on a ship to separate them from their home by literally an ocean, you don't put them on a passenger ship. You put people on passenger ships. You put property on cargo ships. So what would happen often on these ships, they were made for certain kinds of cargo or sometimes made for people, but then when they became what they call slavers, it's what they called slave ships, they would retrofit them, not for comfort, because comfort's for people. They retrofitted them to fit more cargo. That's where images like this come about. Does that look comfortable to you? Sometimes these voyages, depending on the wind and the destination, could take up to 3 months. As you study history, all these kind of random tidbits and facts kind of stick with you. There's no rhyme or reason to it, but it's just usually like just some detail that just sticks out and sticks with you. For me, one of them is that slavers would often have sharks following the ship. Because when people died, as they inevitably did, 10 to 20%, they had no place to bury them. And because it's property, they didn't care about a proper burial, so they tossed them overboard. And sharks, which are scavengers, got a free meal. That's what you do with property. That's why it's called race-based chattel slavery. That's why it's written into the Constitution that we were worth 3/5 in terms of representation in Congress. We can go on and on. But let's think a little bit about how this relates to first lynching and then the death penalty. So, I don't know, how many of you have heard of the Elaine massacre? Yeah. Not enough of us have. It occurred in late summer, early fall of 1919, Red Summer. I'm convinced that the Elaine massacre doesn't get more attention because mainly of 3 factors. 1, a deliberate effort to hide this. Number 2, because the victims were poor and rural. Hear me now. I didn't even say black. I said poor and rural. We know now about things like the Tulsa Race Massacre and Black Wall Street. In my view, one of the reasons why that has gained so much attention, even so much legal action around it, is because they were urban and wealthy. That it was the tragic erasure of black advancement economically. But what do you do when the victims are poor and they ain't in the city? Do we give those victims the attention they deserve? Do we honor the image and likeness of God in poor black sharecroppers? Which is what these folks were. So what happened? These folks, it often comes back to money, y'all, because chattel's property. So white folks wanted to fight a civil war because they didn't want to lose their money in property in persons, right? They call the Civil War a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Think on that. Now, I digress. What had happened was, In 1919, there's what they call a bumper crop of cotton. They were getting premium prices for cotton, actually transformative prices for cotton, such that if these poor black sharecroppers got fair prices for the cotton they themselves picked, it would have lifted them out of poverty. It would have given them an opportunity to buy their own farms, start their own stores, go and get an education. So they wanted a fair price, not more than others were getting, just their fair price. And so what they did was they organized a union. And they had a union meeting in Hoopsburg, Arkansas. And it was this little clapboard shack of a church that they met in, And they had heard rumors, of course, that white folk might show up to try to break up the meeting. So they stationed some guards outside who were armed because this stuff turns violent often. And sure enough, this meeting, which took place late at night, 11 or 12 o'clock at night, 2 white law enforcement pull up. And we don't know exactly what happened because it's a long time ago. There's not great documentation and there's a deliberate distortion of the truth. But somehow a shootout occurred. One of the white officers was killed and the other was injured. Before sunset the next day, word went out on the wire, telegram and newspaper, said, quote, Negro insurrection. That's the word they use when they say these black folks are rising up and they're going to go kill all the white people. There was nothing of the sort happening. They were organizing for fair prices on the cotton they picked. But the interpretation by the white community, because there's always this fear when you oppress a people that they're going to get back at you. There's always this insecurity that what goes around comes around. And that's what they were worried about from slavery up to sharecropping and even today. And so the wire went out, Negro insurrection. So guess what? People came in from Tennessee, Mississippi, all over Arkansas, a mob of white people, and descended on this tiny sharecropping community in Elaine, Arkansas, and for 2 days wreaked havoc. And again, we don't even know the exact numbers because the dead weren't given marked graves. But historians estimate upwards of 200 men, women, and children killed. And yet most of us had never even heard of it. I'd never heard of it till I moved to Helena, Arkansas, 25 minutes away from the site. Let me give you another example. Surely by now, many of you have heard of George Stinney. In 1944, 14-year-old George Stinney became the youngest person ever to have been executed in the United States. A newspaper article at the time described his last moments. It said guards had difficulty strapping the boy's slight form into place. But apparently he went calmly to the electric chair with a book, perhaps a Bible, under his arm. That execution happened after a trial that lasted just a single day, when an all-white male jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before deciding to convict young Stinney for allegedly murdering 2 white girls aged 7 and 11 years old. So this skinny 14-year-old was supposed to have been murdered, killed 2 white girls, 7 and 11 years old. Of course, the case had no merit. But it wasn't until 70 years later in 2014 that a South Carolina judge vacated the decision, saying that Stinney had been denied his constitutional rights. And his surviving siblings who advocated the judicial re-examination insisted their brother had been in the house during the murder and was innocent of all charges. 14. The reason why I bring up these instances in particular is because this phenomenal report, doomed to repeat the legacy of race in Tennessee's contemporary death penalty, makes very clear the linkage between lynching and the death penalty. When we go back to Elaine, I didn't talk about the aftermath. It's horrible enough that hundreds of black sharecroppers were murdered. But then they blamed it on the black people. So they rounded up 122 black people. They charged 75 of them, and they convicted 12 of them of murder. These became known as the Elaine 12. And the way that came about, that they rounded these people up and sent them to court, was this. The white power structure, in particular the political structure, in particular the governor of Arkansas, was worried about PR, was worried about press, was worried about the image of the state. You see, one of the things that we don't understand because we don't have a nuanced understanding of history is that even back then in the Jim Crow era, most white people didn't want to be labeled as racist. So the governor was like, how can we avoid a PR nightmare? Because he knew his white folk. That after black people organized for fair treatment and justice, there would be a backlash, some call it a white lash. And typically that took place outside of the courts at a tree. And so, worried about PR, he goes to the white power structure, the white leaders in Phillips County, Arkansas, where Elaine is, and say, hey, listen, y'all. I know you're mad. I know you want to get your pound of flesh, but just do me a favor. Don't do it with a noose and a tree. Do it with the courts and the electric chair. So there was a deliberate deal made within the white power structure not to lynch black folks, because that would look bad, but you can still get your vengeance through the courts. In fact, they actually had a name for the white folks in Phillips County who they put in charge. They called them the Committee of Seven. 7 powerful, wealthy white men who were in charge of these kangaroo courts that had no element of justice in them. Thankfully for the Elaine 12, it did not end in execution. They tried them in 2 groups. Half the groups got released because there was an appeal and there was a retrial that kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back for years. Meanwhile, they're in jail this whole time, but it got pushed back so much that the courts finally said, okay, you can go. The other group, however, this is interesting. The governor granted them an indefinite furlough. Furlough is time off from prison, but it is not exoneration, and it is not a declaration of innocence. To this day, that group of the Elaine 12 has not been declared innocent. And there's a small movement in Arkansas lobbying the governor to go back and declare their innocence. Because according to the law books, they're still guilty of murder. Same with George Stay. You can imagine easily a scenario where he would have simply been lynched. But it was so much more proper to send it to the courts with an all-white, all-male jury who talked for 10 minutes before saying, kill him. One of the things I say in The Color of Compromise is that racism never goes away, it adapts. Racism never goes away, it adapts. Similarly, the control of black bodies never goes away, it adapts. But you see, the faith element here, we actually have the tools within our faith to respond to crises like this corrupt legal system that sentences people to death. Now listen, everybody's got a testimony, right? And there are some parts that you look back and you're like, what was I thinking? But it's all part of the story. So I came up in a white evangelical Christian context and then moved from that into an evangelical and reformed context. It's very conservative, it's very white, and there's a lot that I disagree with. But I picked up some things. And they have this thing in Reformed theology called the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Westminster Catechism. And you don't have to agree with all of it. There's this portion in there that I think is helpful. Because they go through the 10 Commandments and break down what's required and what's forbidden in the 10 Commandments. And a catechism is a series of questions and answers designed to help people who are new to the faith or young understand what it's all about. And even the folks, the Christians, the white Christians who would be in support of lynchings and executions, they didn't know how right some of their words are because their actions didn't line up. But you can use their words to make your point. Use their own words. And in this, here's what we get. Question 67, what is the sixth commandment? Thou shalt not kill. Just 4 words. Pretty straightforward, right? But when you really break it down, what's required? The sixth commandment requireth all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life and the life of others. Isn't that interesting? First of all, Jemar, you were right. You said that the image of God really has to begin with us. And here we see in the breakdown of the sixth commandment, it says all lawful endeavors to preserve our own life. Love our own life. Love our own selves. Self-care is what they call it today. And from there proceeding to preserve the life of others, which is the antithesis of execution. Then it goes on to say, well, what's forbidden? What does the sixth commandment tell us we ought not to do? The sixth commandment forbiddeth the taking away of our own life or the life of our neighbor unjustly, or whatsoever tendeth thereunto. I like that last clause. Whatsoever tendeth thereunto. That's meant to cover everything else. Not just the physical killing of people, but anything that would diminish life. Anything from a corrupt legal system, anything from disinvestment and under-resourcing, anything from disproportionate pollution in certain neighborhoods and with certain people, anything that would take away life is forbidden in the commandment, thou shalt not kill, but we don't think about it. Some of you all are students, some are past that, and you're into your careers, or maybe you've got your degrees, but I think there is a rich opportunity here for scholars, whether in the academy or beyond, to help us develop a theology of the criminal legal system. To help us think through things like thou shalt not kill as applied to the death penalty, as applied to incarceration, as applied to anti-black police brutality. We have the resources. But we sitting up here like, oh, where do I don't, who's the book, what author, what is it? You don't realize what's in your own toolbox. And you understand theology is something that's constant, right?
Right.
It's never done. You've got to constantly theologize for the present day. And I'm just waiting on some of y'all to lead the way. Come on now. Now, just one more quick thing. There's always the question, well, what do we do? And honestly, you've got better answers than I do. I'm not playing. Some of you all have firsthand experience. You've got family members involved. You've studied this. You've been activists for a long time. You've got better answers than I can provide. The one thing I want to do is give a framework. Some of you have the specific actions, but here's a framework. I talk about this in my book, How to Fight Racism, and I talk about the arc of racial justice. So here's something you can do. I talked about this earlier on the podcast with Jerome Moore. Tune in to Deep Dish Conversations. Here's something real practical you can do. Only if you're serious, because it's going to take a little bit of time, maybe even just 30 minutes. So most of us won't do it. I understand. But if you're serious, what do we do about criminal legal system? What do we do about death penalty? What do I do? Do this. Get yourself a blank sheet of paper or a blank Word document. You put 3 categories: awareness, relationships, commitment. That's the acronym ARC. Then you give yourself 3 months, 12 weeks. I like short time periods because then you got to move. Then you got to add. You give yourself a year, you might get to it. Give yourself 3 months. Under awareness, put your little bullet points. What am I going to do to increase my awareness of the issues happening in the criminal legal system, with the death penalty, with Tennessee. Maybe it's just reading this report. Maybe it's watching a particular documentary. Maybe it's attending a conference or a panel. List it out. Then you go into relationships. And I say, for white people, y'all real good at building walls. You done spent all of U.S. history separating yourselves from black folk and other people of color. So now, your job is to build bridges, not walls. And so you have to ask yourself, how am I going to actually have a diverse network of friendships and relationships? And I said network. Sociologists tell us it's not just that one black friend you got. It's a whole bunch of them that make a difference for white folks. So that's where you live, where you send your kids to school, what church you attend. For black folks, it's who am I going to be in solidarity with? We're not the only ones who've experienced depression, and we're stronger together than divided. We got a lot. If indigenous folk and black folk got together, good Lord. We want to talk about a powerful witness and testimony. So what are you going to do to bring that about? That's relationships. Then commitment. Again, not just staying the course. Yes, it takes commitment. It takes perseverance. But commitment is getting to the systemic, the institutional, the structure of inequality. Beyond the individual, what policies, what practices are you going to try to move and shift to bring about greater equity among people? One real simple thing, help to abolish the death penalty. That's a structural change that will literally save lives. You do that. You make your plan. You use the arc of racial justice, awareness, relationships, commitment, and you will find answers within yourself and your community that you never knew were there. And I just want to close by saying, again, we have the resources in our faith to resist injustice, particularly in the criminal legal system and the death penalty and executions. Why? Because of our Savior. You remember the story. It's Jesus. He is pushed out by his own religious community, rejected. He's betrayed by his own disciple, one of his closest friends. And he's unjustly imprisoned by the state. But if you go to Matthew chapter 27 and reread it, it's rich. It's instructive. Because they didn't execute him right away, did they? Pontius Pilate came and he spoke to the crowd. And he said, I typically release one person. Do you want this guy Barabbas? Or do you want Jesus? Who do you want to be released? And what did the crowd say? Give us Barabbas. And Pontius Pilate said, okay, but I didn't find any guilt in this man. I don't see him guilty of any crime. And they said, give us Barabbas. And what does Pilate do? Washes his hands. How many of us have washed our hands of the incarcerated? Have washed our hands of the people on death row? I'm not responsible for it. Somebody else did it. Well, that somebody else says somebody else did it. And that somebody else says somebody else says somebody else did it. So who's responsible? Who has blood on their hands? The reality is, if we don't act, we all do. Are you your brother and your sister's keeper? And they took him and they crucified him until dead. They executed him. The state executed him. But I'm glad, go back to grammar school, right? Grammar. Jesus' story doesn't end with a period, but an ellipsis. death didn't have the final say. Because on the third day, woo, he got up. Life, resurrection, redemption had the final say. And what does that tell us when it comes to the criminal legal system and incarceration and execution? There's always the possibility of redemption. There's always the possibility of resurrection. There's always the possibility of new life. And we didn't make this up. We saw Jesus. Jesus is alive today because death didn't have the final say. Ooh, that rhymes. Jesus is alive today because death didn't have the final say. And because death didn't have the final say then, it doesn't have the final say now. And because redemption is a possibility for Jesus and for us, redemption is a possibility for anybody. So we, as the people redeemed by Jesus, we don't preach the penalty of death. We preach the promise of life. Amen? Amen. Thank you. That's all I got.
Folks, we do have some time. If folks have some questions, anything anybody's burning to ask, I mean, it's hard to think of anything.
Please come to the center microphone.
All right.
Oh, we're good, okay.
Okay, so my mom used to fight in Texas when we lived there. She used to fight the death penalty in Texas, which is, they execute what, 200 people a year?
No.
They're much less. Okay, well, back when we lived there. And you were talking about blood on the hands. It's on the hands of every taxpayer, because that's who's paying for these systems. So everyone who's a taxpayer is paying for these executions. So the blood is on all of our hands.
It's sobering, isn't it? And it can be overwhelming. One of the reasons why I think so many of us, including myself, are so burned out is because I do believe God has particular calling for us to work for justice. You know, I need to read my Bible more, but in the Bible, it says when you are the redeemed of Jesus, you have these spiritual gifts, right? And these spiritual gifts aren't meant to be kept to yourself. And they're not to be used just to enrich yourself. They're to be used in service of others for love of God and love of neighbor, right? So I do believe we all have a justice calling. It may not all be the same thing. And back to the burnout is, I think what we often do is we take on burdens that go beyond what Jesus has called us to in justice work. That ain't popular because the idea is you do it absolutely as much as you can, absolutely all the time, which that's a recipe for death. We go back to the principle in the Old Testament of gleaning and leaving a little bit on the borders, on the margins, that you don't cultivate, that you don't harvest. Why? The land needs rest. The land needs margin. So do we. So I just don't want us to get overwhelmed, understanding that the racism adapts, right? It's never going away. Control the black bodies is adapting. It's never going away. But actually part of our witness and testimony as Jesus followers is rest. Pacing. Understanding that the work will always be there, even Jesus. Rested. Don't you think Jesus could have stayed up another hour and healed some more folk? Changed some more water into wine? But he didn't. If that's Jesus' model, if that's Jesus' example, who are we? Are we loving ourselves? Are we honoring the image of God in ourselves that says we're not God in our justice work?
Whew, man, that end part, you really got me. I entered this work after I lost my son to gun violence. And when you talk about the resurrection, the redemption, when I was going through the criminal proceedings, struggling with my own anger, and the young man that had took my son's life, and I was like, okay, what are when we're talking about legacy here, what does that look like? How our current system is set up It is not set up for healing. It is not set up for public safety. It is not set up for prevention. So even though I was still angry that this young man had killed my son, I wanted his ability to be able to be redeemable, to be able to restore what he had taken. Because he can't give that life back. But if he can save 10 lives, 20 lives, 30 lives, then my son's death was not in vain. And then when I think about the death penalty, because at that time I hadn't even known about the death penalty, because I was like many others, it was out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
But then when I found out that we were, because I came from up Michigan, we weren't killing people in Michigan. I didn't realize we were killing people here in Tennessee. And I'm like, I'm Muslim. And one of the things it says in the Quran is that when you take a life, you take on the sins of that individual because you did not allow them to redeem themselves. If we execute people, we don't give them that opportunity at redemption. We've taken that away. And so I know that wasn't really a question, but you hit me, man. You hit me hard.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. And your testimony is more powerful than any words that I can say because you've experienced that loss. And you processing it and saying you still want redemption. Even for this person who committed this irreversible act. And I just think that's the testimony we need to hear. Thank you. Cody, what's up, man? Glad you came through.
What do you think the future of the national discourse on race is? In 2020, the Barna Data Group did multiple studies that showed that people were less interested in race post George Floyd that very fall, summer of 2020, than before. And it seems to have gotten worse, obviously, with the book bannings and the things like that. What do you see as the future of the race conversation nationally?
That's a great question with a lot of layers. So one thing we know for sure, is that white folk get tired real quick when it comes to race. I was just telling my students, this is essentially how the Reconstruction era after the Civil War came to an end. Because white folks, and I'm talking about northern white folks, said to themselves, look, we fought a civil war for y'all, we granted y'all your freedom, and now we spent over a decade funding the Freedmen's Bureau and all of these efforts to uplift you people. We're done. We did our part. You're on your own. The fatigue of white folks was at play in the ending of the most promising portion for black people in U.S. history. It's still at play today. 2020. Even less stamina. It's been 6 months, guys. We marched, we protested, we put black squares on social media. We did our part. It's not all white people, right? But as a nation and as an aggregate, that's often what's at play. So we know that after something like 2020, which, by the way, was the largest social movement in the history of the United States, even bigger than the Civil Rights Movement, by far. When that happens, when you got corporations making pledges, when you've got laws being considered changed, when you're defunding perhaps the police, you know not only the fatigue is going to kick in, but the opposition, the white lash is going to kick in. And isn't it interesting that just less than a week after 2020 turned to 2021, there was an attempted insurrection in the nation's capital. So that is always the case. But you ask, what's the future of discourse going to be? Well, we're going to keep seeing some of the things, which, like critical race theory being made into this junk drawer for everything they don't like about racial justice. Similar with the term woke. We're going to see, one of the slides I didn't have time to get to, the increase in the legislation, making it harder to learn about race and justice. So this says the number of anti-critical race theory measures taken by U.S. government agencies in 2022 was largely driven by state-level action in politically red states. Hello, Tennessee. So the gray indicates the measures introduced. The red, orange, pink, salmon indicates the measures accepted. Blue states, red states, purple states at the state level. At the local level, lower measures introduced, still predominantly passed, the red, in red states. But we see these enormous numbers of political measures designed to repress the kind of information that you all are learning in this series. And so the future of the discourse will be dominated by repressive forces. One of the things that really irks me, you ever heard of PragerU? It's this far right, I think Heritage Foundation funded. It's this right-wing revisionist history view of the United, and that is being approved to be shared in schools. So what we're up against, people of conscience, people concerned about truth and justice, is a media melee. I like that alliteration. A media melee, and all that war of media. And that's why I appreciate folks like Jerome so much, because he's using social media to share truth. You've got some local folks here, Danielle Koch Balfour, Garrison Hayes, who are younger folks who know the media landscape, who are sharing truths about history, about theology, and they're doing it in a compelling way. So the future for folks like this and groups like this is to adapt and be innovative and creative in our storytelling and our dissemination of information. And if you're not the one to do it, like I'm not the one to do it, how do we support those who are? That's what I think.
How you doing, Dr. Tisby?
I'm hot, but I'm good.
I can understand that. I saw you when you were here probably 3 years ago at Christ Presbyterian Church. Wow. 2 questions. One is, American Christianity redeemable? And I ask you that because you use it in your work quite a bit. And all social movements have a theology. And so there are competing social movements going on. And all of them have a theology. And they all seem to claim the same thing. So how do you sort through that? Or is it even worth sorting through? You know, there is a theology of MAGA, there's the theology of even what you're talking about, there's this theology. So is Christianity up to that?
That's great. Oh, that's the question, Doc. That's the question. Howard Thurman, the great theologian and mystic, asked if there was something wrong with Christianity. He asked, is racism a betrayal, he used the word, of the genius of Christianity, or somehow inherent to it? And with Thurman, who wrote the book Jesus and the Disinherited, which Martin Luther King is purported to have carried with him around on his travels, where Thurman came down is that racism is not inherent within Christianity. That the genius of Christianity is justice and equity. And I bring up historical examples like that because men like Howard Thurman and his contemporaries have gone through it. It wasn't abstract to them. They weren't just studying it in a classroom. They experienced the racism. They experienced the discrimination to a degree that folks like me and younger can't even imagine. And yet still came on the side not just of hope, but of Jesus. And you say, every movement has a theology. You're absolutely right. Right now, the dominant theology in terms of a narrative is the theology of white Christian nationalism. White Christian nationalism, which I define as an ethno-cultural ideology that uses Christianity as a permission structure for the acquisition of political power and social control. Ethnocultural, meaning white. Christianity as a permission structure. It's an imprimatur. It's a approval of their quest, which is not to follow Jesus, but to pursue power and control people according to this very narrow conception of what they call Christianity. So they have a theology, and guess what? The new Speaker of the House is the most white Christian nationalist speaker we've had. So we need to be on guard. We need to be aware of these theologies. But somebody said we're prisoners of hope. Me, I'm not only a prisoner of hope, I'm a prisoner of history. Because when I look back on saints like Fannie Lou Hamer, born in 1917, the 20th child to a sharecropping family in Mississippi from the same county, one of the most notorious senators, Eastland, James O. Eastland, was from. And she would have lived and died in obscurity as a black woman sharecropper had not in 1962 she heard a presentation on voting rights at her church. And when they asked for volunteers to go register down at the courthouse, she said, I raised my hand as high as it could go. And so began her civil rights career. One of the high points was her testifying at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. She's asking, is this America? Right? But what's so notable about Fannie Lou Hamer, because there's many, many activists, but what's so notable about Fannie Lou Hamer is her ardent, forthright, unashamed faith. She was known for her beautiful singing voice, powerful singing voice. One of her favorite songs, This Little Light of Mine. Yeah. She would sing that on the march. She would sing that to rally people. She sang in the rural Mississippi prison when they beat her so hard it said it felt like she was made of stone, and she suffered lifelong chronic injuries because of the torture she received in that rural Mississippi jail, and she sang. And in doing so, she wasn't innovating. She was drawing on a legacy. Remember Paul and Silas? I think it said they sang in prison. Because this is not worldly. This hope that we have is not earthly. People didn't give it. The world didn't give it. And so the world can't what? That's what I said.
James Combs' book, Between the Cross and the Lynching Tree, challenges America's version of Christianity as insufficient for appropriating the lived experience of black people. So America's version of Christianity, as you pointed out in terms of Howard Thurman's question in The Disinherited, what I'm thinking about the theology of incarceral life, the theology, the lived experience of your testimony and the theology that comes out of that story, is how can, as particularly the place where black people assemble, mostly in the black churches, how much of the toxicity of American Christianity does not allow for the emergence of a new theology of resurrection?
That's right.
Because we go there as the central symbol and the central event of Christianity. But we never go beyond the fact that that theology of resurrection calls all of the followers of Jesus, as you follow on into their own martyrdom and their own sacrifice. And you painted the picture so well tonight that George Stinney, I have a picture of George Stinney on my little place, so when I sit down to write, I remember him. That George Stinney, in 14 years old, and whatever it was that he had in his home, whether it's a Bible or not, his 14-year-old frame was vulnerable to American Christianity. And we are vulnerable to that same version of America, unless we give our people new vocabularies, new theological constructs, because Christianity itself is a social construct. and that construct continues to be relanguaged in popular culture. And the mega church movement, black church movement, it becomes therapeutic and coping, but not liberative.
Woo.
Thank you.
I see why you're the president. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Let me say a couple of things, and it really relates back to your question. Again, the power of history is helpful here because any oppressed and marginalized group, their theologies are inherently liberative if they're moving toward equity. So when you look at the U.S. context, the theologies that have arisen out of the historic black church are instructive. And because black Christians have always seen the hypocrisy and the artificiality of many expressions of white Christianity. And I'll give you one example. You all know this one. Frederick Douglass, in the appendix to his first autobiography, wrote 3, by the way. He's very full of himself, I guess. 3 autobiographies. But in the first one, he writes this appendix where he says, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I see the widest possible difference. That one phrase is so instructive because it says that as a black Christian, he understood the difference between expressions of Christianity given by white people, which were pro-slavery and pro-segregation and white supremacist in nature, and the actual heart of the faith, which is found not in a principle or a theology, but in a person, the person of Jesus. He said there's a difference. And black Christians have always seen the difference. Even though the headlines and the media, what passes for Christianity is often what white people say, think, and do. Look to the margins, which is in the other point I want to make. How do we discern between these theologies? Follow the path of power. What do I mean? Jesus in Matthew 25 talks about the poor, the orphan, the widow, the prisoner. Howard Thurman called them the disempowered. We sometimes call them the last, the least, and the lost. That's who Jesus had concern for because Jesus was a brilliant sociologist. He said, how you treat the least of these, my brothers and sisters, is the real test of your character. Not how you treat the wealthy and the powerful. How you treat the poor and the disempowered is the test of your theology. And so as I look across the theologies of every social movement, we follow the path of power. Who is this giving comfort to? Who is this protecting? Who is this elevating? If it ain't people like Fannie Lou Hamer, then we're probably off. If it ain't people on death row, then we're probably off. If it ain't the people of the Mississippi and Arkansas Delta, then we're probably off. We make it too complicated when in fact it's quite simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. But follow the path of power.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I am pricked. I heard you earlier talking about the internal. And so much of when folks think about justice and justice work, there's this outward focus. So how do we begin to help people become more self-aware of the need for justice work, how justice work looks, and what we are seeking in this justice work? And I'll say this, I've heard you 2 or 3 times, for example, use the term equity. And so how do we get people, what do we need to do to get people to understand the nuances and the terms in justice work, the things that we stand on to help us get to the destinations that we're trying to get to? So you use equity, and folks think equity and equality are the same. And so what is it? What are some steps that we need to take to get people to become more self-aware so that it's not so much exhaustion for the ones that are already doing the work?
Yes, thank you for that. There's sort of two questions in there. One is, knowledge and awareness of the terms, for instance, equity and equality, right? But I'll just go back to the arc of racial justice. The awareness portion is massively critical. See, we really think that we know this race thing, but it's actually constantly shifting because it's socially constructed. And as societies change, so will definitions and contours of race and racism and white supremacy. So we have to stay up on it. It's like a doctor that has to stay up on the latest research in their field in order to have the best solutions and best prescriptions. You can't rest on what you learned 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's constantly shifting and changing. Some of that is through this multimedia landscape. Some of that is, I think we really have to get back to the grassroots, right? Because we often look for the macro change, the big national solution. I don't think there often is one, but it happens at the community level, in groups like this. If you get up on the terms, then you spread that where you are. And it's not as satisfying as seeing some dictionary definition adopted, word of the year equity or something. It may not happen like that. Maybe it does, but probably not. So it's incumbent upon us to constantly build and hone our awareness, and we bring that wherever we go. The other portion you talked about, I think that's really important. How do we raise awareness about self-awareness? Particularly, how do we raise awareness about loving yourself well, that you might love others well? Number one, I think we need to be models of it. So I just text messaged a friend of mine who is a therapist, but what makes him such a good therapist is that he's in therapy himself. And you can see him working through it. And what is so beautiful about it is he owns his brokenness. He owns his shortcomings and the ways he's hurt others, and he's working on it. Nobody's perfect, but you can tell the people who know their stuff, their baggage, their garbage, and are working on it. What I'm saying is deep here.
Right.
Because we are groomed by society to hide shortcomings,
Right.
to never say we're sorry, to never repent. But the safe people in my life, the ones around whom I am naked and unashamed, are the ones who have looked at themselves in the mirror and said, you know what? I got some issues. But I'm not going to leave it at that. I'm going to constantly work on getting better and being who God has always called me to be. That's the testimony. When you are a healthy person, you become, this is a different application, but the aroma of Christ. People can sense it around you.
Right.
Some people, your healthy self-love will smell like the aroma of death because they're not ready to deal with their own brokenness. And they want to get as far away from you as they can, or they want to tear you down and show you and others just how human you are.
That's right.
But to others, it will be the aroma of life. Because you may not even be able to name it, but you're like, you know what, there's something different about them. They're just who they are. There's no pretense. There's no performance. They're messed up. I don't like this part of their personality, or they did this to that person. But they're working on it. They're very clearly in process. And I can be that too. How do you do it? What are you doing? So it really does start with us. But guess what? That self-care stuff is very expensive. Like, seriously, it's a matter of equity, because so much of what makes it hard for us to love and care for ourselves is poverty. Everybody says get a therapist. They cost hundreds of dollars. If you can find a good one who understands racial dynamics.
And time.
Yeah.
And it takes time, which is also a resource, that people can be poor in because they're constantly working just to survive. So part of this has to do with a reshuffling of resources and structural changes that even allow people to care for themselves. Maybe one more. No, very good. We're past time anyway. I do want to say I'll be out there signing books if you want to get a book, and there are t-shirts and all that good stuff. But again, I felt very at home here. Thank you for being such a welcoming, attentive, thoughtful group. Have a good night.
Thank you, Dr. Tisby, Professor Tisby. He's given us a wealth of a syllabus. And as I always say to the students, if we assign a reading, you just don't read it once and you're done. I'd like to say the same is true of this verbal wealth of knowledge that we received today. The recording to tonight's session is on the American Baptist College YouTube page. Please take it as you're working through your arc of awareness, relationship, and commitment to action and work. Go back and timestamp. Watch it with your groups of care and concern. What can you zero in on? Professor, you put a slide up there, and it's like, what? You gonna bake me like this? Because one of the things, okay, this for the class. No, the preacher's been up here. I'm the heathen in the group. I'm the lawyer. But look, he talked about, you saw the red bars, and you saw the states that have the anti-CRT, right? Okay, students, dig deeper. There's actually a Tennessee law. It is, if you want to know, 2021 SB 623. Look it up on the website. Read the full text. Bore down into it. Read it as carefully as you're reading your Bible verses. And find out what it does and does not say, and what you can do with it, because that might be the C part in the arc of your commitment that makes this more than just another conversation. Yeah. But if I have to come back to the theologians, the beautiful image that we have and the image that you have invited to vision for each other actually leads us to next Friday's session. What could this look like? What could repair, reconciliation, forgiveness look like? We have our own Rafia Muhammad McCormick and members from the Rafa Institute who will be talking about in this community institutions and resources of repair as we continue to rebuke and reject the fact that we are doomed to repeat. Thank you.
Excellent.